In 1997, I think I went to my first IANDS conference. I had my experience in spring of '95 that changed my life, and when I was kind of guided to this conference. It was in Texas, and I heard about a lot of people, including Barbara Harris, now Barbara Harris Whitfield, and I bought a couple of her books there, and I read them, and I just absorbed it as part of my early learning and my early education on the subject. And over the years, I went to conferences, and I never saw her there, but I knew she must exist somewhere. And over the last year, her name's come up a couple times. I said, "Oh, it's time." My guides are always very good at telling me who to invite when, and I really give them credit for the wonderful speakers who come to our meetings, because I know it's not my decision. At any rate, I called her, and she said she would be delighted to come, and we were very delighted to have her. And I hope you'll give a warm welcome to Barbara Harris.
Now what I want to do is tell you my story and then open this up to questions, because that's my favorite part. So I can start off by telling you I was born and raised in Detroit, Michigan, very similar to Chicago. I was born in 1943, so that makes me 67 now. I had my near-death experience, 2 of them, in a striker frame circle bed. Do you all know what that is? It looks like a Ferris wheel for one. It's 2 big round hoops with a stretcher in the middle, and the patient can't move, the bed moves the patient. I lived in one of those for a month. And then I was in a full body cast for 6 months. So I'll get to that in a few minutes, but just to give you some background, I had a very, very dysfunctional childhood with a lot of physical abuse and, of course, emotional abuse, and absolutely no spirituality. And by the time I was an adult, which I considered myself to be an adult when I was 18 and I got married, now I realized to get out of my house, I was an atheist. I figured, you know, if God couldn't protect me from the kind of childhood I had, there probably wasn't a God. And I was numb, I was an atheist, and suddenly had 3 wonderful children, and they were my life, and we had everything imaginable. We lived in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. We had our own airplane, swimming pool, you name it. By the time I was 30, I had the American dream. And there was something so missing. I was so shut down. At the age of 30, we came here to Chicago to visit my husband at the time's relatives who were here. We met in Chicago, and we were staying at the O'Hare Holiday Inn. And it was Sunday morning, and my husband at the time thought it would be really funny to push our daughter into the pool with all her clothes on. And he got a laugh around the pool, so my 9-year-old son thought, okay, he pushed me in with all my clothes on, and I didn't expect that. And as I went over into the pool, my foot hooked on the side. I don't know if they still have it at the O'Hare Holiday Inn, okay, but there was a curb. This was 1972, 1973. There was a curb around the pool, and my foot hooked on the side, so when my body went into the water, there was a snap in my lower back. Oh, no. And I couldn't move, and I was drowning. Oh. So my husband looked and saw me there, but at the same time, our younger child had pushed a 3-year-old in. And that father had taken out his 3-year-old and was on my husband, ready to kill him, because he had watched the chain reaction. So I'm drowning. This is not when I had my near-death experience. And my husband was finally able to go and pull me out. And was very angry over what had happened and told me to go pack up the kids. We were going home. So, and I had actually broken my back. Went back to the room, packed up 3 kids and us, and we drove the 4 hours back to Detroit. And I spent the next 2 weeks in bed trying to get better, and I wasn't getting better. So finally, a friend of ours made contact with an orthopedic surgeon who was a sort of friend, and he met me in the emergency room of William Beaumont Hospital in Royal Oak, Michigan, and I drove myself there. When you drive yourself to an emergency room, you're not going to be taken seriously. So not even any x-rays, but I got a prescription for, it wasn't Demerol yet, I forget how I just worked my way up on all the pain medication, and Valium. as a muscle relaxant. And I spent the next 2 years with them upping the amount of narcotics I was taking and Valium, 4 hospitalizations with traction, and finally what they call a rhizotomy, which is really painful, and I won't go into it, but it burns sensory nerves. And then finally what they told me after 2 years was they realized I wasn't getting better and I was consuming a lot of drugs. And they wanted to do a spinal fusion operation, which I immediately agreed to because I knew I wasn't getting better. They were just treating the symptoms. So I went in for 2 hours of surgery, which turned into 5.5 hours because there was a lot more damage than they had seen on X-ray. And I woke up in the striker frame circle bed, and I was on so much morphine that it was like, oh, what a weird bed. But it really wasn't striking me. I remember people walking in, my relatives, and thinking, they really look sick, what's wrong with them? Not realizing they were looking at me and they were getting upset. And about 3 days after surgery, I started to die. I had a respiratory therapist come in, and I'm now a respiratory therapist, but at the time, I didn't know, I didn't understand any of this. This respiratory therapist had hooked me up to a ventilator to give me a 20-minute treatment called IPPV, and what it is positive pressure flows into your lungs and expands them because I couldn't sigh. I couldn't get a deep sigh. And what he did was he left me on the machine, which you're never supposed to do. And the machine did not stop or reverse itself. I can remember this frightening feeling of air. It was like somebody stuck a hose in my mouth and turned down the water. Only this was air, and there was no way to exhale. And it was so scary that I passed out. And the next thing I knew, I was out in the hallway, and it was nighttime because the lights were dim. And I looked up and down the hall, and I thought, oh, if they catch me out here, I'm going to get into trouble. Because I'm supposed to be suspended in that bed. Yeah. So I turned around to go back into the room, and I was looking directly into the PA speaker, which I knew was mounted on the ceiling outside my doorway. And that's when I knew something was wrong. Something was up, and it was me. I was up at the ceiling. And I came back into the room, and I looked down at her. It certainly wasn't me. Me was up at the ceiling, feeling so peaceful, more peaceful than I had ever felt in my life. And I looked at her, and I remember chuckling because they had tape wrapped around my nose, holding a tube down my throat. And the next thing I knew, I was moving through it. I didn't have a name for what I was in, but later on as a researcher, I said, yeah, tunnel is probably the best word in the English language. Whatever I was moving through was totally black, but what caught my attention was wherever the edge of this blackness was, there was energy churning, and out of this energy churning was coming light. And I thought, isn't that something? That the light comes out of darkness. And it was moving ahead of me and forming the light. And as I was moving through this, I suddenly felt these hands come in and pull me into this lush warmth. And I realized it was my grandmother. I used to call her Bubby. It was my Bubby, and she had died 14 years earlier. And I had never once thought of her existing beyond her death, but we were together. And as I moved into her, it's like the two of us merged, like we became one. And together, we re-experienced all 19 years we were on the planet together. It was incredible. I could see through her eyes, I could feel through her heart. I knew that she could see through my eyes and feel all of my feelings, and we went through every scene. The one that I love, that I remember the most is, I'm about 3 years old. It's Friday, which is going to be our Sabbath, and she and I are cooking a Sabbath meal. The whole family's going to come that night, so there's this expectancy in the air of it being Sabbath. And she pulled one of these heavy wooden chairs up to the stove, and she put me on it, and she had her arms around me to protect me because there was this big pot of boiling water, and she was dropping these little tablespoons full of a mixture, and I was rolling them, 3 years old, dropping them into the boiling water, and her hands were right there to make sure I didn't hurt myself. And it was gefilte fish. We were cooking gefilte fish. And when we were all through, I smelled my hands and I went, yuck! And she pulled me into the middle of the room on this chair, and I can still feel the belly laugh of the way the chair bounced to the middle of the room. And then she took her apron and she wiped my hands and she said, don't move, Bubby, we'll be right back. And she went to the sink and she cut open a lemon. and she rubbed lemon on my hands. Now my grandmother and I had one aunt that gave me love. Those two women were so important in my life. And as I went through to the 19 years, and then she was dying, and I was saying goodbye to her, I started moving away from her. And there was this psychic transmission, heart to heart, where she was letting me know that she would always be there waiting for me. And it was okay. And then I was back in my body, back in the circle bed. And two nurses came in to open my drapes. It was morning. And I couldn't handle the light anymore. My eyes had become so super sensitive to light. I had to keep the door closed because I couldn't handle the sound of the page anymore. All of my senses became so heightened that it became very irritating to me. And I said to these two nurses that came in, I left the bed. And they said, no, honey, you're hallucinating. I said, no, you don't understand, I left the bed. And about the third time we went around, they sedated me. So I wasn't going to talk. About a week later, it happened again. This time I had been rotated onto my face in a circle bed. 3 times a day they put pillows over you, and then they put another stretcher on, and then they put like belts around to keep you together, and then they rotate you over onto your belly and lift off the other stretcher so that we don't get bed sores. That's what that was for, and to drain my lungs. So I had been rotated forward onto my face. It had been the 20 minutes and nobody was coming back. So I went to hit the nurses, the button that they pin onto the sheet, and that had fallen away. So I started calling, and then I started screaming. And nobody could hear me because the door was closed. And I'll just stop for 1 second and tell you, I was not near death. This was a week later. I was off the critical list. And for any of you that have had your experience during extreme trauma like this can trigger a near-death experience. And there's even, I was working with a woman who just got her doctorate, and her dissertation is called Trauma and Transcendence. And I can talk about that a little more later. But my second experience is a perfect example of going through trauma and leaving my body. So I'm out of my body again, and this time I'm awake. I can see my body in the circle bed moving away from me. And I looked down at her, and she was crying really hard. And then I looked out into the darkness again, and there I was at about a year old, face down in my crib, crying just as hard. And I looked back and forth, maybe 3 times. And then I thought, well, I don't want to be her anymore. I'm going to the baby. As I said that, I realized I had carried this bundle of toxic pain, that's what I call it, my bundle of toxic pain, on my shoulders for that whole 32 years, and it was from the abuse in my childhood. That bundle of toxic pain moved away, and I was totally me again. And at the same time, I felt this incredible energy wrap itself around me and move into me so that we were one. And just like with my grandmother, I could see through her eyes and I could feel through her heart. This energy let me feel through its heart and see through its eyes. And we went to this baby, and the baby was in a bubble, and this bubble was the center of a cloud of thousands of bubbles, and in each bubble was another event in my life. And what I went through was a life review. It seemed like it took 32 years. It was the whole thing all over again. And I watched the abuse, and I kept thinking, no wonder, no wonder. I kept hearing my no wonders through the whole thing. And what that meant to me was, no wonder you are the way you are. Look at the way you were abused as a child. I mean, here now I have my own 3 kids, and I know how much love they need. And I was getting abused. But at the same time, I could see through this presence that was holding me. I could see through this presence, we can call him God now. I couldn't call him God for a lot of years. I could see and feel through God's heart and eyes what was going on. And as it evolved, and especially seeing my mother abusing me and abusing my brother, part of what I was seeing now was how miserable she was from her childhood, but her childhood had been even worse. And I could see my father's, what I had called neglect, was really, he just didn't know what to do, so he shut down. He didn't leave. He could have left. He didn't leave. He stayed, but he never tried to stop it. And I watched the abuse continue and continue through my childhood. And every time I said no wonder, this presence held me tighter. And what I realized was, first of all, there was no right or wrong. It was just the conditions and their background and their parents' background and their great-grandparents' background was all being played out again. And at the same time, this presence let me know that the more important relationship wasn't what I was watching, but what this presence meant to me. That that's the most important relationship that we have is our relationship with God. And then I was floating back into this reality, but I didn't go back into my body.